Hi, and welcome to this video, which is going to be about what a former Republican calls the conspiracy to end America. Now, as Trump's lawbreaking becomes more apparent, his hold on the Republican voters is growing stronger. Three things have been happening at once. First, Trump's legal peril is increasing. Second, Trump is making things worse for his case through his public statements. And third, he is solidifying his position as the frontrunner for the Republican nomination. I'm going to suggest that it isn't a coincidence that these three things are happening at once. So during the last week of June, a recording of Trump showing off classified documents at Bedminster was leaked to the press. There was a particular recording of this that I found helpful because it added the text as subtitles. So I'll put a link to that in the notes to this video. If you haven't listened to it, you should. First, some background. Trump was apparently miffed by an article in The New Yorker, which was all about how General Mark Milley stopped Trump from launching a military attack against Iran. What seemed to be happening in the recording is this. To refute the claim that Trump was about to start a war with Iran, Trump, in a meeting with some people, waved around a secret war plan, which he said had been prepared by Milley and his team, and which, Trump claimed, proved that he wasn't the one who wanted to launch a military strike against Iran. In the recording, he described the war plan as highly confidential and said, "As president, I could have declassified. Now I can't, but it's still secret. It's so cool." So, in this recording, Trump demonstrated that he knew, 1, the plan was secret, 2, the document was classified, 3, he no longer had the power to declassify it, and 4, he wasn't supposed to show it to anyone. Poof, there goes several of the defenses that he's been floating. His first line of defense, a while back, was that he could declassify documents just by thinking about them. So he couldn't get in trouble for having classified documents because in his mind he could declassify them. After this tape was released, and there are obviously documents, he said that by plans, what he was referring to actually were building plans and plans for golf courses strewn around his desk. Later, he said, "I would say it was bravado. If you want to know the truth, it was bravado. I was talking and just holding up papers and talking about them, but there were no documents." Then he added that he had lots of papers, quote, stacked up, and the stack included newspaper articles, copies of magazines, copies of different plans, copies of stories that having to do with many different subjects. Well, as everyone knows, a person who keeps changing his story is lying, but Trump doesn't care, and neither do his supporters. People who are caught up in an us versus them politics want their guy to win by any means necessary. They glorify strongmen and fighters, and lying is another way of fighting. Thus, Trump supporters cheer as he lies. Now, one of the things that's happened that surprises some people is that Trump's lead has been growing after his second indictment. Remember, his first indictment was in Manhattan, having to do with the hush money payment. And his second indictment was the federal indictment having to do with these classified documents. Now, a new national NBC poll showed that Trump's lead expanded over DeSantis and the rest of the Republican field after his second indictment. I've said in the past that Trump's political needs are at odds with his needs as a criminal defendant, and he has made the decision to put his political needs ahead of his needs as a defendant. His hope seems to be that he will become the next president of the United States, which he can do, even if he's convicted on all 71 charges against him so far. There may be complications if he's sentenced to prison by a state court, but if he wins the election, meaning that enough voters vote for him so that he wins the Electoral College, he will have all the powers conferred on him by the Constitution. He will then seek to finish what he started during his first term, which would be what he's promising to do, dismantling democratic institutions and establishing himself basically as a Putin-style autocrat with the full support of the Republican Party. His campaign promise is to dismantle democratic institutions. So if elected, he'll be able to claim that he's acting on a mandate from the voters. He will enter the White House next time furious and ready to wreak revenge on his enemies. Now, given what the Republican Party has become, it's not a coincidence that Trump's hold on the Republican Party is solidifying as his legal peril increases and as his lawbreaking becomes more obvious. In the spirit of us versus them politics, his supporters are driven by a desire to avenge Trump and land a blow on Trump's enemies. The only people surprised by the fact that indictments have increased Trump's standing with the Republican Party were those who insisted all through 2021 and 2022 that indicting Trump would save democracy. I was about to start naming them, but I won't. But I'll point out that even Elie Mystal now sees that even strong indictments will not stop Trump. He said it'll take more than an indictment to make Donald Trump face justice. The 37-count indictment against Trump is strong, but if we want him to be held accountable, he must be defeated at the polls. Mystal also understands the solution. The only way to beat this is at the polls. You've heard me explain in past videos why it makes sense that the current Republican Party will not reject Trump if he's indicted. Now, let's hear it from a former Republican insider. I was given an advanced review copy of Stuart Stevens' next book, The Conspiracy to End America: 5 Ways My Old Party is Driving Our Democracy to Autocracy. I read it and liked it as much as his first book, It Was All a Lie, so I provided this blurb. The Conspiracy to End America is 2 stories in one. It's the story of how the Republican Party came to reject democracy as a governing principle. It's also the story of a former Republican insider and political operative confronting the painful truth that the party he once worked for has embraced authoritarianism. Pain is the best teacher in politics, says Stuart P. Stevens. He thus concludes that the only hope for the Republican Party is for it to suffer crushing defeat after crushing defeat so that it is forced to confront its failures. When Stephen talks about the Republican Party rejecting democracy as a governing principle, what he means is the party is rejecting rule of law. Explanation. A government is defined by how it derives its authority. A democracy derives its authority from laws rather than the whim of an autocrat. People reject rule of law and democratic institutions when those institutions do not produce the kind of country they want to live in. There are not many alternatives to democracy. Sociologist Max Weber, in his classic essay, Politics as a Vocation, says there are 3. There's autocracy, which derives its authority from the word of an autocrat. There are monarchies, but those take time to establish. So people who reject rule of law and democratic institutions must either embrace autocracy or anarchy. As Stephen puts it, it's always the case when an authoritarian movement emerges from a democracy, the justification for abandoning democracy was the danger that democracy itself presented. Thus, what Stevens meant by the conspiracy to end America is this. If the Republicans have their way, America will no longer be a rule of law democracy. It will become an autocracy. Because democracy isn't accomplishing what they want. It is not creating the kind of country they want to live in. It's important to keep our history in mind. The United States was established as a rule of law democracy, but only a small group of people, white, mostly landowning men, were included in We the People. For most of our history, all of our institutions, governors' mansions, Congress, industry, universities, were under the control of white men. There were a few exceptions, of course, but for the most part, the laws protected white men. Others were legally under the dominion of white men. It wasn't until the modern civil rights and women's rights movement that this began to change, and the backlash has been fierce. Compare these 2 pictures. This first is from Congress in 1939. This one is from 2018. I happen to have it handy because I included it in my biography of Thurgood Marshall. Theirs is a movement driven by racial fear, Stephen says. The United States will become a minority-majority country in only a few more years, and all the Stephen Millers in the world can't stop that. How fast is America changing? In 1980, Ronald Reagan won a sweeping landslide victory over Jimmy Carter, garnering 489 electoral votes and 58% of the white vote. In 2008, John McCain lost a not very close race against Barack Obama and received 58% of the white vote. Stevens explains that what is motivating the Republican Party is the deep fear that the party is doomed. He said this: "The Democratic apocalypse confronting the Republican Party is both a powerful motivation for it to do whatever it takes to guarantee victory, and its justification for doing so. If you believe that America was chosen by God to be a white Christian nation, then the looming specter of minority-majority America demands action." He also says Trump ran as a racist, and once the Republican Party embraced him as their leader, it legitimized threads of extremist conspiracies that had previously been limited to the ecosphere of the far right. In other words, Trump just brought out what was already there, simmering. He made the subtext into text. He stopped using dog whistles and openly embraced the anxiety of a certain segment of the population that something vital was being destroyed in America. Stevens pulls no punches. He says, Trump's hate was creating a surge of appeal. Stevens talked about how Republican insiders went along with Trump in 2016. He said the responses uniformly went like this: "If we, the party establishment, puts our thumbs on the scale when Trump loses, it will not be because of his xenophobia, his racism, his anger. It will be our fault. So we just have to let him lose and then start over." Stevens would invariably respond, "But what if he wins?" And the answer was always, he's not going to win. Because in 2016, Republicans argued that they could mold Trump should he become president, Stevens compares the backroom deal that made Hitler chancellor to the way the Republican Party backed Trump in 2016. Then, after the Republican Party accepted a platform that was nothing more than a pledge to Donald Trump, it abandoned any pretense of being anything other than an autocratic movement. Now, here's the important part. This is from Stevens. If Trump is not ultimately the party's nominee in 2024, its loyalty will pass to the next leader. In other words, getting rid of Trump will not solve the problem. The Republican Party will simply look for another Trump-style leader who will similarly promise to eviscerate rule of law and prevent what they see as the ruin of America. So Stevens marches through all the problems we know. Dark money in politics, Republican lies, for example, the lie about election fraud, notions that are both wrong and dangerous, like we are a republic, not a democracy, gerrymandering, Republican efforts over decades to appoint conservative judges, the origins and purposes of the Federalist Society. His conclusion: it is naive and foolish, but predictable, to imagine that there is a possibility for this Republican Party to become a normal American political party once again. So basically, he sees no hope for the modern Republican Party. He offers a solution. The only way to stop the Republican Party's march toward authoritarianism and rejection of rule of law is for the party to lose at the ballot box. Like Mistel, he understands that the only way to stop the Republican push toward autocracy is at the polls. Well, that wraps this one up, and thank you for listening.